Okay, hi everyone. I'm Laura. I work at Southampton Football Club in the UK. I'm going to talk to you today about how we use our understanding of the players, our experience and expertise of the staff that we have at Southampton, to make the data we collect matter. So it probably won't be as researchy or as sciencey as the incredible experts we've had on before, but a little bit more of an insight into what we do in practice. I hope you find it interesting. Okay, so this suspicious looking person is me. I am currently the first team sports scientist, which I've been doing now for about a year. Before that, I was just on the data side of things within the first team. Now my role is to monitor, analyse and feedback all the performance data for the first team at Southampton, as well as overseeing the data processes throughout the club and down to the academy and the women's and girls. As well as the data side of things, I also get involved with delivery, so on and off pitch conditioning and rehab sessions as well. Alongside working in football, which I've done now for a number of years, I've also completed my PhD in workloads and injury risk in elite football players, which I finished last year. You can probably tell from that picture that I was still doing it at the time. I'm a little bit more smiley now. So I'll move on to what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I don't know how popular this is going to be, but when I first started working in football, I worked in the academy and it's very development driven. So we focus on getting the best out of the players, both in terms of making them the best athlete and making them the best person they can be to increase their opportunity to make it into a first team football club. Once you get into the first team, the focus is very different. It's much more on performance and results. So in my opinion, when you work in a first team environment, no matter who you are, what department you work in, success for you is scoring more goals than the other team. It's great if you can squat heavier. It's great if you can run faster or jump higher. But in my opinion, we should all be focused on scoring more goals than the other team. I'm not a coach. I can't teach the players the tactical insights they need to outplay the opposition or the technique that they need to be the best footballer in the world. But as a sports scientist, I feel like our role is to ensure that that player has the physical capacity to be on the pitch to give them the best chance of scoring more goals than the other team. So at Southampton, we collect a lot of data, we collect a lot of numbers, we monitor the players a lot. I can talk about it all day long. I love numbers. I'm a proper nerd. Today, because I'm time restrained, I'm just going to talk about two of the key aspects that we look at, which is programming workload and speed exposure. I'll do a little bit of what we do and a little bit of why we do it, but my focus really is on how we do it, how we make it actually matter, and how we make a difference in practice. Okay, so first up, programming workload. So we program in 3-week blocks. We go for an overload week, a maintenance week, and a deload week. I'm sure you've had this already. I'm just going to go real basic. Overload, more than you've done before. Maintenance, same as you've done before. Deload, less than you've done before. I don't need to go into the science behind it. With the aim being, you give a player a training stimulus. You give them time to adapt and recover, and then you can hit them harder with a better training stimulus, with a higher training stimulus. So that goes on to my next point. The aim is that over a period of time, depending on what we're aiming for, whether it's a season or up to Christmas, the aim is to increase the player's capacity for load. So what would start off as a high week becomes a deload week because they get more tolerant to load, they can cope with more because you give them enough recovery and adaptation time between each stimulus. My last point is that whilst we're trying to push that as hard as we can and get better load capacity, there's a ceiling to it. There's no point in pushing the players beyond the point that they need to and increasing their risk of injury. We play maximum, as Chris has just said, 3 games in a week. If we're playing 3 games in a week, which is usually only over Christmas, the players, if they're playing in each of those games, don't train in between. They'll recover, maybe do a bit of shape, but ultimately they're just playing. Second worst case scenario is they might play 2 games in a week. If they play 2, they'll train really lightly in between. So worst case for us is they need to be able to do 3 games worth of work in a week. That's our upper ceiling, and we push them to that. We don't need to push them any further. There's no point getting them to do 100k in a week, training becoming a shambles, because we don't need that time. That time could be spent better in the gym with the physios doing individual work, or at home with their families getting some work-life balance, or whatever they do when they're not at the training ground. Why we do it. Okay, so why do we program load the way that we do? So our manager and as a club, we believe that we need to outrun our opposition to give us the best chance of winning the game. We've consistently done that since mid-November. So as a squad, our high-speed running and sprint distance has been higher than our opposition's in every game. And that's not one individual running way more, that's as a squad. And we think this is important because it increases our ability to win back the ball. It allows us to create more goal scoring opportunities, and it allows us to play our high pressing game. Okay, so that was the practice, the science behind it. Most of you should have seen this before at some point in your sports science life, but this is sales general adaptation. Theory, I know that it's received a lot of criticism because it doesn't take into account the individual responses to the stress adaptation. And it's a real oversimplification, but let's face it, most of us still use the principle that you apply a stimulus, you let them recover, and then they increase their resistance so you can apply a greater stimulus. If you don't let them recover, there's a potential that they'll get overtrained and injured. Really simple principle, but it works, and this is why we program in 3-week loads. I also did some research back in the day which suggests that 3 weekly accumulative loads is the most linked to injury risk, so that's another reason why we look at 3-week loads. But it's an accumulation of both in-house and external research as well as just experience in practice. Okay, speed exposure. So this on the screen right now is a typical GPS report for us for a day. Most of you, if you work in sport, will have something similar. It's nothing groundbreaking. It shows what each player has done in the session for our key metrics, and then how it compares to what they've done in a game. So the percentages are for that player, if they do 6K, for that player it's 66% of a game. What I want to draw your attention to though is not those metrics, but this column at the end that is days since 90%, and that's how many days since they hit over 90% max speed. Pretty self-explanatory. We try and do it once a week. That's what we've decided as a sports science team, that once a week our players will hit over 90% of their max speed. Why we do it? For hamstring conditioning. So here's the whys in practice, and sorry this is teaching you to suck eggs, but players need to be able to run fast to win the ball off the opposition, whether that's defending or attacking. It's important to be able to run fast, and they need to be able to do it without popping a hammy, whether that's in the first 5 minutes because they're not warmed up properly, the 80th minute because they're fatigued, or because they've come off the bench cold. We need to make sure they're conditioned to producing this high intensity action without getting injured. The science behind that, so there's some papers out there that suggest that sprinting is a vaccine for hamstring injury. Subjectively, we would say that has been the case for us since we've been doing this regular speed exposure. And then in the research as well, there are papers that suggest that there is nothing that replicates the muscle activation that you get from sprinting. So it's great. Do your Nordics, do your hamstring strengthening. It does create some adaptation. It does cause some muscle activation, but nothing in comparison to actually sprinting. So that's why we do it, and that's why we keep on top of it with our players. Okay, so that was my whats and my whys. I'm aware that I'm speaking really quickly, so I'll try and slow it down a little bit. Okay, this is, I really like this visualization. It shows that load capacity for each individual is very, very different. For me, this visualization says that not one objective measure can tell you how much a player can tolerate, because it's so influenced by that individual, by the situation that you're in, by the environment, by what's going on in their brain at the time. This slide shows that you need to know your players. If you're going to program them load, if you're going to give them speed exposure, you need to know everything about your players. You need to be experienced. You need to have seen this sort of shit before. You need to have expertise within your department so you can handle the differences in individuals. Okay, so how we do it, and this is the most simple and effective thing that we've started doing as a team. So every day, once training's finished, once gym's finished, we have a wash-up meeting. Nothing sciencey. We just all get together in a room, all the key stakeholders, and we share information. What's really important about this meeting is that it stops everybody working in silos, everybody collecting their own little piece of information and never linking them together. It also means that everybody has to share every player interaction that they've had, or everything that they think is relevant for the day, so that nothing gets missed. And just to talk you through this diagram of who's in there. So we have our club doctor. He leads the meetings, mainly because he has to go to the manager and tell him who he has got and who he hasn't got for the weekend, or have an argument with him at least about it. Then we have our full-time members of staff. They're the guys in their yellow circles, and they're with the squad on a daily basis. The guys in the grey circles then are our part-time staff or our consultants, and they meet with the players one-on-one to deal with their individual needs. So the collection of expertise in the room is massive, and it just allows communication to flow. So going back to what I was talking about, programming load. So we talk about a lot in those meetings, but I'll just stick to the two key aspects that I decided to choose for this presentation. The first thing that we do is, this is the same GPS report you saw before. What we do is everybody has it up on their screen, and it stops me just sending it out as an email and it being dismissed. I'll just talk through the key points that people should be looking for, so they don't have to troll through numbers, especially if they're not numbers people. I will just talk through the numbers. So for you guys today, I've highlighted a player whose outputs were a lot lower than everyone else in the squad, across the board, and definitely for his position. When I mentioned this, I also said that it's now been going on for 3 or 4 days, at which point the soft tissue guy said that he's been treating this player over the last few days for stiffness in his back. And then the psychologist said that this player's got something going on at home that might be distracting him on the pitch. Now, bringing together all that information allows us to know what to do with that player for the next few days. Worst case scenario for us is to pull them out of training or modify their training. What we try and do is support that player as best as we possibly can to get what we need out of them on the pitch. If they're injured, if they can't train, that's a different story. But if they just need a bit more support, we can provide that. So can we give them more psych support for what they've got going on at home? Can we make sure they're getting regular soft tissue treatment, or that they're seeing the physios for some stretches on their back? And then another player that I've highlighted down the bottom of the report has higher accel and decel outputs than the other players, and compared to what he would typically do in a game. What's really useful is when you have a technical coach in the room, because then he told us that he pulled that player to one side at the end of the session and done some individual work with him based on some weaknesses that he'd shown during gameplay. Now, that doesn't create a yellow flag for us. That's not like, oh my God, you can't do that. But what it helps is understand the context behind the numbers, and potentially helps the S&Cs modify what they're going to do with them in the afternoon in the gym, because they've done extra workload outside. So all that passing information just makes what we do in practice richer. Okay, something else that we do for programming workload. So we don't only look at it on a day-to-day basis, but on a weekly basis too. So if we take the current week as the last week on the graph that's circled, and then you can see that it's building up similar to the second week on the graph. This week was supposed to be an overload week. So when we're at this point, we need to think, where are we going to get our load from now for the rest of the week? Because we need more sprint distance and we need high speed running. The technical coaches will typically already have their drills planned for the week. So as sports scientists, we talk with them about how they can modify the drills to get more high speed running or more sprint distance, so that we can get the overload that we need and we don't end up with a flat line. Again, having all this information passed around means that no one feels like they're having their toes stood on. It means that everyone knows where everyone's coming from, and it just means that adherence to plans is a lot better. And I just thought I'd show you an example of one of the drills that we do to get some running out of the fullbacks when we're doing more intensive drills, so they play as wing backs up and down the pitch for both teams. Okay, and then on a more individual basis, so we look at what the squad needs from a programming workload perspective, but also there's individual fluctuations if they're not playing, if they've been injured, which is the case on this graph. So the graph on the left, it's a pretty complicated graph with a lot of numbers. All I want you to focus on is the red bars, which show the accumulation of workload over each week. So each red bar is a week, and then you can see that the player for the last 3 weeks has had a pretty low exposure to sprint distance. What we do then is work out how we can get that workload into that player. So if it's not going to come from training because the rest of the squad don't need it, what can we do to make sure that player gets some exposure? And it depends on the player, and it depends on the time that you have with that player. We could just do real quick, repeated sprint efforts across the box if we haven't got much time, or if the player just wants to get it done with. But most players want to know that you care, want to know that you've thought about it, and want to know that it's specific to them, especially if they're being pulled out after a session to do it. So we'll get together with the analysts, we'll find clips of that player and how they move in a game, and we try and replicate running drills that look like the movements that they would produce. We also try and get a technical coach involved, because mostly players like to work with the ball, not just running up and down the pitch. Okay, speed exposure, how we do it. So, like I said before, we try and get speed exposure once a week. The players that are playing regularly, so they'll typically play Saturday to Saturday, we'll get it on a Saturday when they're playing. And then we have a match day +1 session for the subs and the players that didn't make the squad. We'll try and get speed exposure on the Sunday for those players. Again, it's working with the technical coaches to produce drills that will get that speed exposure, and speaking to the physios about who can and can't be involved in that. If they don't get it over the weekend, whether they don't get it in match play, or for whatever reason the technical coach doesn't want to focus on speed exposure, we'll warn the players early in the week that they didn't get it over the weekend and it has to come from training. This gives them the opportunity to get it out of the training drills. If they don't do that, they know that on a Wednesday they're going to be pulled after the session, and they're going to do either a couple of rolling efforts with a curve, or it's going to be something a little bit more individual to them. Again, totally depends on how much time you've got with the player and who the player is. We've found that this works a lot better than trying to get a group speed exposure at the end of a warm-up. Because group adherence to something like speed exposure can be pretty shocking. All it takes is one player to not feel it for the day, and they can bring down another 3 or 4 others with them. Also, it's pretty difficult to keep track of them all. Even if you've got it live in front of you, once they've had that effort, if they haven't got anywhere near it, it's quite difficult to make them do it again. We also found that we have more injuries when it comes off the back of a warm-up, no matter how good that warm-up is, than when it comes from a session where they're properly warm. Obviously, if it's been the hardest session in the world and they're knackered, we're not going to do it at the end. So it's a little bit of a subjective balance there. Okay, what about right now? I'm sat at home, all of you guys are sat at home, and so are our players. So just to give you an insight of how we're handling it at the moment, our players are provided with sessions to complete each day, and they've been given the equipment to do that. So they've been given watches, bikes, and basic gym equipment. They fill in their sessions through an app, which we can all see, and then we give them feedback on how they've got on compared to the rest of the team. The staff and players have been split into smaller groups. So in my group, there's myself, a physio, a soft tissue, and a psych. And then 6 players, and we work to make sure that their individual needs are dealt with and they have the wellbeing support that they need. We call them up each morning, we chat them through their session, and then we keep them engaged throughout the day with little tasks. We still have our Washup meetings. So every afternoon, the staff get together on Zoom and we just have a chat about how the day's gone and keep the communication open. So that's how we are at the moment. Last thing from me, so my take-home message is, sorry it's not been dead sciencey. If you want more science, ask me questions afterwards. My take-home messages are, we are all trying to score more goals than the other team. Data is nothing without context, knowing your players, the expertise of your team, and the experience of your team around you. And if there's no action, there's no point. So if you're measuring and monitoring, you've got numbers coming out your ears, and it's not making a difference, sack it off. Do the things that matter. Thank you very much.